This is the highly anticipated Caddx Moonlight 4K camera. Now, today is not a review because I can't review this product and I will explain why later on in this video. What it is more than anything is an overview of this, what I've been sent, my findings of what I've been sent, and at the end, some thoughts of what we have here. Now, just to be clear, I was sent this VTX kit over by Caddx pretty early actually, and I've had it now for about 6 to 8 weeks. I have not paid for this, I've not been paid to make this video, and as always, my thoughts in this video are entirely my own. I have not shared this video with Caddx before it's been published. No one has had any influence on this video, as you will probably see as we move through. Anyway, let's get on with it and let's talk about what this is first of all, and then we'll get on to the detail. Okay, now to walk you through what you get in this Moonlight kit first of all. Now it looks pretty much the same as any other box you get from Caddx. If I slide the inside tray over, inside the first thing you will find is the foam tray holding everything, and you get this little leaflet as well which gives you the basics, the instructions, but we're not going to worry about that today. Now in this kit you get the VTX, the camera, a filter, 2 antennas and some cables. Now the really interesting stuff obviously is the new VTX and the camera. Now the first thing you'll notice is this VTX is a lot larger, or at least deeper, than all of the other Caddx ones. Whilst it's similar in shape and size that way, depth-wise, it is substantially bigger and a lot more like what we've seen from the likes of DJI on the O3 or the Caddx Vista. We then have our camera up front here. You can see it comes with an ND8 filter as standard. This actually slides over the lens like that. If I remove it out the way, you can see the main camera there. On the sides, they've included these little rubber vibration isolation mounts with it as well, and then you've just got the back plate there that heads down to the VTX. Then in the kit you've got a little bag full of screws. There are multiple different cables here which we'll need as we move through the video, and then we've got our 2 usual antennas that Caddx do include with their VTXs. Not the greatest in the world, but certainly not the worst. Okay, now taking a closer look at this new camera, it is 4K, capable of up to 60 frames a second in 4K mode or 100 frames a second in lower resolutions. Size-wise, the camera is 19mm wide. It does have rubber isolators built in each side around the mounting points to help with vibration isolation, and its depth front to back is 24mm. It is fitted with a starlight sensor which should give great night performance. It has an aperture on the lens of f2.1 and a maximum field of view of 160 degrees. The camera does have a built-in gyro sensor, which means it supports both gyro flow as well as image stabilization. There is an onboard image stabilization option going to be available on this in the future, but you can always export your footage into gyro flow and stabilize it manually as well. The camera also supports 3D DNR noise reduction and has a number of other little features like manual ISO controls and all of the kind of options you'd expect to find on a modern FPV cinematic style camera. The really interesting changes though are here in combination with that camera, and that is this new VTX. Now this is a bit of a 2-in-1 unit, and we'll actually tear it down later to give you a bit more of an overview. We'll take a look at the size and weight in a second, but you can see on the top there we've got our camera input under that little panel. If I flip it over to this side, you can see you've got your mounting areas. So you've got your bolts that go all the way through there, and then you've got your mounting posts there. If we just take a look at the size on them, so we do have a 20 by 20 there and a 25 by 25 on the outside. If we look around the VTX, what you'll notice is there is an SD card slot for the DVR. There are 2 USB connections here, one for the DVR board and one for the VTX side of things. If we move it around, you can see the 2 antenna ports there, dual antennas on this VTX module, exactly the same as the V2 2-antenna model. And then if I spin it round to this side, you can see you've got your main input connection, which is your harness connector. There is two pads next to it there for the TX and RX. You've got your bind button, and then you've got your LEDs, and then there's nothing else to see around there. Now, with regards to the VTX on this kit, overall the specification is the same as we've got before on the higher end models, so it's still capable of up to 30 dBm of RF output, dual antennas, and pretty much everything is the same there with regards to that side of things. Now, what's quite interesting about the setup on this is the differences in how it works compared to, say, DJI. The O3 Air unit is a complete all-in-one entity. However, this is very much two separate parts. You have the camera, which connects to the DVR, and the DVR connects to what is basically a traditional Caddx VTX. The DVR is sitting between the camera and the VTX. However, with the work that Caddx have done, they say that it does not increase latency no matter the mode that you select, and we'll be doing some testing on that later on in this video. With regards to that onboard DVR, as I've showed, it has an SD card slot and it will record directly to that, and it's capable of recording up to 150 megabits a second, and that is allowing you to get some really decent footage from this unit compared to what you may have had on the previous DVR. With regards to size, if we actually get the VTX out, you can see it is 34.4, so 35 by 35. And then the depth on this is 14mm to the thinnest parts. But if we include the standoffs and the bolts, we're coming in at 17mm. So that is a little deeper than the others. You're going to be talking probably 16mm, 16 and a bit to that point there. Little bit taller than the other ones, however, not shocking, and pretty much what we've seen from the likes of HD0 and now DJI with O3. Just taking a look at the weight, if we just zero the scales, if we put the camera and the VTX on together, you're coming in at 39 grams, and if I just drop the camera off to the side, about 31 grams for the VTX. Obviously, the cable could be having a little bit of impact on that, but 31 grams for it on its own. Now, with regards to fitting antennas on this, it looks like there's meant to be a plate that goes over here. However, I don't actually have one in this kit. I don't know if there is meant to be a plate there. I'm not really seeing anything here. It does appear that there should be one, but in the kit I've got, there certainly isn't. So what we're simply going to do is just clip the antennas on, and I'm not going to worry about that for now. What we do is simply pop them through the hole. This is going to be a little bit of a more challenging one compared to some of the others. You might want to get yourself a set of tweezers to actually go in there, because it's not going to want to just pop in and pop on quite as straightforward as the others. There we go. There's that one there done. We're then going to pop that one on there as well. There. And obviously, if yours comes with a plate, you're going to want to screw that on to hold them in place. I don't have one, so we're just going to leave it at that. Now, for my testing, I have built this Air unit into the new AOS 5 version 5. Now, this fitted into this I managed to get the Air unit in the back and the camera in the front without any modifications. I had to actually do a slight change to where I put the camera up front, spinning the cable upside down. But other than that, it was absolutely fine. Whilst I did say in my review for this quad that you may need to get the longer cable if using it with the O3 Air unit, with a little bit of a modification to where the cable comes out of the camera. So instead of it coming out the bottom, I simply flipped over the back plate and it comes out the top. There is enough length to get it installed without too many problems. Now you can see I've got it bolted in there to the bottom, and it fits in nicely just like you would see an O3 Air unit. There's no problems at all getting it into any frame that'll take an O3 Air unit. This new Moonlight is going to fit in absolutely fine. I did custom print a bracket for the back of this frame to hold the dual antennas. Then I had to make a little bracket to hold the connections on for the antenna because I was missing that back plate. Other than that though, it is installed and ready to go. Now, with regards to uploading the firmware and offloading the footage on this VTX, everything is quite simple. You've got your SD card slot that's used for your recording, but also for upgrading the firmware as well. As I mentioned earlier, though, this is basically a standard VTX in this. It still has the onboard memory on this VTX as well, but Caddx appear to have disabled it in the firmware. What they do, though, give you in the kit for this VTX is this little cable here. Now, this is needed to link the VTX to the DVR board in firmware updates. This cable is not needed when you're using the VTX in normal use, but when you're uploading the firmware, you're going to need to plug this cable in to make sure the two boards can communicate. What you do is plug it in with the little white dot to the white cable, making sure that it is the right way round. So I'm going to plug that one in there like that. Plug that in like that. That links the two boards together inside for the firmware update. I strongly advise not leaving this connected, because if you did and it fell out in flight, you're not going to be able to update the firmware on this VTX in the future. Now, whilst this Moonlight camera kit with its new air unit may look and feel a lot like O3, there are some really big fundamental differences between the way it works. For instance, the O3 air unit that's in this afterburner prioritizes the footage over the latency of the system. So for instance, on O3, when you set it to 100 frames a second modes, regardless of the resolution, you get the lowest latency when using it with the goggles 2, or 120 frames a second when using it with the V2s. However, if you stick O3 into 30 frames a second, for instance, you get the worst possible latency on the RF link, and there is no way to separate off the latency and the frame rate of the system. You are giving up latency for the frame rate that you choose. This, though, works differently. You still have the same option to set high or low latency modes, and that dictates the recording modes that are available. For instance, in the low latency mode, you only have the option of recording up to 1080p in either 60 or 100 frames a second. However, if you put the system in the high latency mode, that then allows you to record in 1080p, 2.7K in 4K in modes such as 30 frames a second all the way up to 60. This system prioritizes the latency over the recording modes, so it doesn't have an effect like you see on the O3. There is, though, something a little bit strange to the way this works, in the sense of you can set it to be in 60 frames a second recording mode whilst being in the low latency mode, which means you have a camera recording at a different frame rate to the live view latency. We have not seen this on DJI before, and it's the first time that we've seen it on here, and it's interesting to see what Caddx have actually done here, because the sensor is going to need to refresh at the rate of the FPV link, which would be 100 or 90 frames a second, yet you're recording only 60 frames a second, so you're having to either dump frames off, or you're having to do some form of processing to allow this to behave smoothly. Now, on this chart, you have all of the results of my latency testing on the various modes. I've also put at the far right the original Avatar VTX system in low latency mode as a comparison. If we start right to left, we obviously have that original Avatar HD system coming in at 24 milliseconds to first pixel, or 32 milliseconds to full frame. Then we have the pretty much same mode on this new Moonlight DVR, which is 1080p low latency mode, and you can see the latency is pretty much identical. That's what I would class as within error, and basically there really doesn't appear to be any penalty for having that DVR between the camera and the VTX, and they've done a really good job with that MIPI pass-through. If we then move down the chart further, we have the DVR 1080p 60 frames a second mode, which is again low latency, and what I mean by 60 frames a second, that is the DVR recording at 60 frames a second, but the the FPV system in low latency, and again, very similar numbers. We then shift over to the normal latency modes. We've got the 4K 60 recording and the 4K 30 recording. Obviously, the latency numbers increase here, and you do need to be in that normal latency mode to have that 4K option. However, overall, it isn't terrible. It isn't going to be as low as you would expect to get in the low latency modes, but if you did want that higher image quality, you are going to have a payoff as a result of the increased latency. As you can see from the latency results, we do have some compromises like we have on 03, and whilst it doesn't work quite the same, the reality is if you want the very best image quality, you are having to give up latency. We don't have an FPV system today that allows you to have the lowest possible latency and the best possible image recording. HD0 isn't compromised in the sense of the recording modes affecting the latency, but they don't have a SkySide DVR. Both DJI-03 and this Caddx system basically have a payoff if you want the best image, because you're going to have higher latency. Now, just to walk you through the options that you do get on this DVR and this camera in this new system, if I go on to the main settings page, I'm just going to show you it first of all in 720p and standard frame rate. Now, under the VTX setting is where you have all of the options. Pretty much everything is the same, apart from the resolutions you have available. In this mode, you have 720p 60, 1080p 60, 2.7K 30, 2.7K 60, as well as 4K 30, 4K 60, and that is the main recording modes in the high latency. Moving into the low latency mode, this will give you the options for 720p 60, 1080p 60, or 1080p 100. That is all the settings for the DVR, but we then have some new settings for the camera. We have our scene modes available, allowing you to switch through these. We've got sharpness settings as well as max ISO settings available. We have the 3D DNR function, which reduces noise in the image, as well as manual shutter controls as well. Now, as with any product I receive, I put it through a whole suite of tests here on the bench. That includes thermal testing, latency testing, as well as functional testing to make sure it works as expected. Now, in this testing, a number of issues did come to light. For instance, this new VTX is designed to work on an input range up to 6S voltage. However, in my testing, I found that the VTX would overheat pretty much continuously when using it recording on 6S. Shortly after I found that, Caddx actually sent me an email to say they have found a hardware issue on the pre-production VTXs, and as a result of that, they don't recommend using it with 6S voltages, but the production model that you're going to receive if you buy this should not have this issue. Unfortunately, as a result of this issue, all of my thermal testing has been a complete waste of time. I have thermal imaging of how this VTX performs, all of the tests I was going to talk to you about, showing you how it is compared to the others. However, I can't do it because the hardware that I've got is not going to be the same as the hardware that you're getting, and is pretty much a complete waste of time. Now, before we move on to showing you some flight footage and discussing the recording capabilities of this unit, what we're going to do is tear it down. So let's get it apart and see what's actually going on inside. Okay, so I've removed the screws. We've got the 2 there in the corners, and then we've got the 4 larger bolts that go through. Now, this top lid should lift off. I did just start the process, and it released. There it is. It is starting to come up. Oh, there's a board coming with it. I'm going to be very careful on that. I'm just going to pop my nail in. There. We've then released this top cover. And then that reveals the first board inside this VTX. Now, this is our camera input connection here. And then we've got some power regulation down here, some chipsets. We can see the board is labeled. It says Avatar STR main version 1.2. And then if I carefully flip it up, there's a ribbon cable there going to that side of the board. 1 second. Let me just flip it up this way. Oh, it's just popped free. There's a ribbon cable there that goes from what looks to be the SD card slot down to the board. There's also a power cable going through there. So if I just lift that up, and then you've got that other cable down there, looking like another MIPI interface cable that goes to the board. What I'll do is I'll just carefully pop him free. There we go. That has now freed up that board except for the wiring that goes between the two. So if we take a closer look at this, oh, there is an IC on that side there. We'll take a closer look at that, and I'll put some proper images of that up later on in the video. We've then got that MIPI type interface that seems to go from the top board down to the bottom board. What I'm going to do is call this the DVR board and the bottom board the RF board, very similar to what we have on 03 actually, because you've got your antenna connections on that bottom board down there. So what it looks like is your camera comes into this top board. There's an SoC there. That is the SoC that's probably doing the video processing. I actually think they've masked that off or laser etched it. We'll check it in a minute. There's some additional ICs here with cooling. And then we've got our output down here, our SD card output, as well as our MIPI output, which is then heading off to the bottom RF board. Nothing in here right now looks the same as we've seen on any of their other VTXs. It all appears to be custom. That SD card board seems to be sitting on top of the other board down there. And in fact, that is all glued in place. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that out. But what we'll do is we'll flip it over and see what we can do. Now, I've removed the screws on this side of the case. What we're going to try and do now is see if I can get this side off very carefully. There's not a lot of places to get in on this. What I might do is put a screw into that mounting point and see if we can give this side a tug. Yes, we can. That released that. Oh, and this is starting to look familiar. That says Avatar Lite version 1.3. Now, is that the same VTX as the more recent Nano ones? I don't know. It does look very familiar in the sense of our input down there, power regulation there, bind button there. That is very similar to a couple of the other VTXs. We're going to have to see if it is identical, but they may be using a standard board. I just don't recall all of that shielding around the outside on any of the other ones, but we'll have to take a look and see what we have. Okay, now just to compare it for a moment to the new version 2 VTX, but this is the single antenna version. I don't actually own the dual antenna new version 2 VTX that they released. However, if you look, it's basically the same. I suspect, and I can't confirm 100% right now, however, I really do suspect that that is basically the version 2 antenna VTX, and that's what they've used in there. You can see the component layout is virtually identical, but the board is slightly different. This board is a little bit bigger. This one looks a little bit more trimmed around the sides, but it might be the same board they're using in the dual antenna one, but obviously that isn't something I can confirm 100% at this time. Now, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting this board out, so I'm not going to push it any further at this moment in time. This board, as I've already said, looks virtually identical to the version 2. I suspect it is that 2 antenna version, but what they've done is there's some glue around there that seems to be holding it in place. The more interesting stuff, though, is on this DVR board, so what I'm going to do is get this clean up, and then we'll have a look at what is actually going on here, because the reality is there's nothing particularly new or interesting from the looks of it on this one. I can see the PAs down there from through the holes, so I can still see they're using the Skyworks one. So overall, from the RF board point of view, everything looks the same. It's just the DVR board we need to understand a bit more. Okay, now just to walk you through this board in a bit more detail, as I've said, the VTX basically looks like the version 2 antenna one, and we're not going to dive into that anymore. The DVR, though, is something new. Now, the main chipset here isn't able to be identified from the unit itself. However, based on some digging in firmware by Junus, I want to say a big thank you from me to him for doing that. It turns out it appears to be another IC from Artisan. Now, we don't know exactly which one it is, but it does appear to be some DVR IC from them. Artisan are the same company who provide the main IC on the DVR, and it seems like they're using another one of their chipsets here. Then, if we look around the rest of the board, things are actually very familiar. We have, again, the Dialog DA9062 voltage regulator IC. We have some RAM down here. We have a converter chipset. Again, that's another chipset from a company that we've seen before. They use those Lotium chipsets in their FPV goggles. That is actually used for their display controller. And again, they're using one of them in here. And then we have our MIPI interface with some voltage regulation over here. If we then skip over to the back, we have some more memory, some RAM, we have a flash chip, and then just some passive components, another voltage regulator, as well as a MIPI interface and the SD card interface that goes down between the boards. The way this DVR has been designed is it's basically two separate products in one. You have the VTX and the DVR. They are entirely separate entities. They have separate setups, and basically they could work independently. And in fact, I've had it confirmed from Caddx that they intend to release this DVR board as a standalone unit. Now, just a bit of a warning, do not tear this VTX down unless you absolutely have to. It is incredibly difficult to put back together. The ribbon cables for both the top and bottom boards, as well as the SD card slot, are very hard to reinstall because you need to actually put them onto the bottom of the board as you sandwich the VTX closed. They are not long enough to do before you put it together, and you have to actually go through the gap between the boards with a set of tweezers to try and put them back and reconnect them. My advice would be to only tear this VTX down if you absolutely have to as a result of having a problem. Next, we're going to take a look at some footage, and I'm going to talk you through this as we move through and share with you some of my thoughts. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is compare it to DJI 3. This is a static recording of the beach in 4K 30, and what we're going to do then is switch over to the new Moonlight camera DVR kit to show you how that looks in exactly the same situation at the same time. The first thing you will notice is that the field of view is much wider on this new Moonlight 4K camera compared to what you get on DJI. Putting them side by side, you'll also notice that the color science is a little different as well. More yellower image on the Avatar Moonlight kit compared to DJI, but overall I do think it looks quite nice. What is very clearly noticeable though is the difference in field of view, as well as the fisheye effect that you're getting from that wider lens. You'll also notice, looking at the footage, that the Caddx image on the new Moonlight kit is a lot sharper than the DJI one, and if we actually zoom in to take a closer look at 5 times, you can see that the DJI image looks a lot more muddy compared to the Caddx image, but the Caddx image does have a lot more noise. It is definitely a lot more sharpened compared to what we get on DJI, but it is giving you a bit more detail. Now, the first bit of flight footage I want to show you is recorded in the 1080p 60 mode. The reason for that is this is the mode that allows you to have the lowest latency. Remember, as I said earlier, you have the up to 60 frames a second in 1080p when using it in low latency mode. If you want to get the 4K mode, you're going to have to reduce it to the normal latency, and that gives you the 2.7K and 4K options. Now, I will say that there is a bit of a difference in how the image looks between the 1080p and 4K modes. I've started with 1080p because I'll be honest, this is where it does seem to struggle. The image is dramatically over sharpened. There's quite a lot of noise in the image, as well as just overall grain. It really isn't able to deliver the same kind of image in 1080p 60 low latency mode as it does in 4K, and you will actually see the difference between that and this in a minute. Now, these initial flights were designed to be just quite slow to give you an overview of how the image looks. Again, the sharpness is really sticking out, and it is also quite dramatically visible in these modes when you zoom into the image as well. Moving over to the 4K 30 mode. Now again, this has to be in the normal latency mode, and as you can see, the image should look quite a bit better than we were getting in 1080p. Whilst the image is still very sharp, there does appear to be less noise and less of that digital artifacts that we were seeing in the original 1080p footage. Overall, in 4K, I actually think it looks fairly nice. It certainly isn't as good as DJI-03, but it's definitely better than what we had before on the previous Caddx cameras and DVRs. There is no question that the image is still over-sharpened, but you should be able to dial this back in the camera settings. Sadly, I just haven't had enough time on this to be able to test all of the other camera options, but I really don't think the 4K mode is terrible, and most people should be pretty happy with it as it comes. Finally, just to show you some evening footage as the sun was going down, this is the Caddx Moonlight camera. Here you can see how it looks again on a static image recorded in 4K. And then I will switch over to DJI-03 just to give you an idea again how that looks. It definitely does a better job than the DJI camera overall in low light conditions as a result of that starlight sensor. Finally, I just wanted to share with you a bit of footage from my initial test flights because I noticed some very strange behavior with this starlight sensor. This was actually the very first flight that I had on this camera and drone, and you will see at times some flickering appearing on the image as I'm moving between the light and dark. Now, I don't really know what this is about. It appears to be caused by that starlight sensor trying to switch between sort of day and night modes. You can see it is just at times appearing as the scene goes darker. And also, this footage is really good at showing you how the lens distortion is on this camera as well. It is something that I have fed back to Caddx, and hopefully it's something that they can improve in firmware in the future. But it is something that I did just want to show and demonstrate that I did find in my testing. Okay, now before I share with you my thoughts, I just want to talk about pricing. Caddx have shared with me that this new Avatar HD Moonlight kit is going to be available for $189. That is the DVR unit with the built-in VTX, the camera with the ND filter, as well as the 2 antennas. There is also going to be a Moonlight camera and recording board option available. That is going to come in at $110. You're going to be able to use that with your existing Avatar HD VTXs. So again, that's making it a $110 upgrade to get some of the functionality that you've seen here today. And actually, I think this is a really interesting option, and I'm pleased that Caddx are sharing both of these options with users, so you don't just have to go out and buy a whole new kit. You can use whatever you've got already with some modification to get these new benefits. For that money, you're getting a DVR and 4K camera system that is capable up to 4K 60 frames a second, supports gyroflow, image stabilization, up to 160 degrees field of view, night capable camera, as well as that dual output VTX, again capable up to the maximum 1200 milliwatts. Okay, so to share with you my thoughts on what I've seen. Now, I'm just going to pop up on screen the firmware version that I used to test this. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head as I'm recording this video, but that is the firmware that I have used in this video. Overall, Caddx have released a product that sits somewhere between what they had before and the DJI O3 Air unit. Ignoring the issues that I mentioned just now, the Air unit does provide some decent DVR functionality that you didn't have on the original VTX, but it doesn't work the same as DJI O3. It does limit you in some way. So for instance, if you want to fly in that low latency mode, you're limited to up to 1080p. And frankly, the 1080p recording mode isn't great. You only get the best from this in 4K. And whilst it's still not up there with the likes of DJI O3, it is definitely better than what we had before. In 4K, in the higher latency mode at 30 frames a second, the image actually does look really nice. I like the colors that this camera has, and overall the image quality is decent, but in every mode it is way over sharp and there is a quite substantial amount of noise showing depending on the light level. There are settings with regards to the dynamic noise reduction that you can play with, but I didn't get time to mess with them before I published this video, and frankly I wanted to test it in the stock configuration as you would receive it, and that is what I have showed you here today. There is no question that it is an improvement over the original DVR, but it certainly isn't as good as what we get on O3. It sits somewhere between the two. That isn't to say, though, Caddx isn't able to make more improvements in the future, and we're just going to have to wait and see how that turns out. There is, though, some very interesting things about this DVR and the kit. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Caddx are going to supply the DVR and the camera separately. The DVR basically sits between your camera and the VTX and has a MIPI pass-through, and it has no real effect on the overall latency of the system, and that's really good to see. However, the bit I still don't fully understand is how we're able to have the mismatch of frame rates. So for instance, we have the camera running at 90 or 100 frames a second for the live view in low latency mode, yet the DVR is recording in 60. You can record it at a matched frame rate, which is fine, but you can reduce the frame rate. And they must be doing some form of binning on that DVR to allow that to happen. I will say though, the camera does look very good in 30 frames a second mode, even though it must be binning frames compared to the live view being at 60. And it's nice to see that Caddx have continued to develop the Avatar HD system. And whilst this might not quite be up there with O3, it's certainly the best you're going to get on this today. Although, as I said earlier, I wouldn't be throwing your action camera out quite yet. In the end, what we have here, sadly, is what we've learned is a typical Caddx release. We have a product that has huge potential. What I've been sent isn't quite what you're going to get, and the firmware that I've got has largely been half-baked up to this point in time. I've not really had enough time on this new firmware to make real concrete decisions. The product, though, does have a lot of potential, but that potential isn't being fully realized here today, and there's going to be some time needed before we really understand what this Moonlight DVR is capable of. If you're interested in getting this, what I'm going to say today is very much be aware that the product, as I have seen it, may not be fully ready for the prime time, and I would personally hold back until we've seen how things develop. There's going to be a whole host of reviews out today, probably telling you how amazing this is, but frankly, I can only tell you what I've seen, and what I've seen is hardware that doesn't quite work properly. However, I've been told you won't get that, and firmware that still needs work. I really hope you have found this video interesting, and I really hope what I've been able to provide you today has been helpful to you. I'd love to have been able to sat here and say, hey, this is amazing, go out and get it, but here and now I think it's a beta product, and as such you should take that into account before purchasing. I'm really interested in knowing what you think about this video. Please do put any questions and comments below and I will try and answer them. And finally, I just want to say, if you have found this video interesting and you'd like to support us to allow us to keep making content like this in the future, please do consider checking out the links to my Patreon as well as Buy Me a Coffee. I want to say a massive thank you to all of my Patreons, channel supporters and everyone else who has donated to the channel. We would not be able to do this without your support, and if you think we've earned your support today, please do consider checking it out. Anyway, that's it from me on this one. Stay safe. I will speak to you soon.